This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our first two virtual Defence and Security Studies events of 2021 are a survey of four major international adversaries in a rapidly changing international system. Tonight, Marcus Kolga of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and East Asia correspondent and commentator Jonathan Manthorpe discuss Russia and China.
Now, given that tomorrow is January the 20th, we are only one sleep away from a historical but fraught change of power in the United States. And leaders and policymakers around the globe are contemplating how this change will affect the global environment in all its dimensions. In particular, issues and challenges in the realms of defense and security remain on the edge. And with the addition of a great and not so great power competition piling on to still extant threats of failed states, terrorism, and insurgencies, while the last 4 years arguably saw a diminishing of Western power due to pressure on NATO and other organizations and mechanisms of Western solidarity, compounded now by the global pandemic, it's clear that states such as China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have used this opportunity to expand their influence and pursue national objectives to the detriment of Western interests and values. Now, Canada has not been exempt from these shifts in global power, and some observers of Canadian defense and foreign policy have called for a fresh examination of our national position as a so-called middle power, as well as having a hard look at the assumptions on which our national defense and security posture is based. Tonight, we have an excellent opportunity to take an in-depth look at two of the states which the Canadian security establishment recently identified as the greatest strategic threats to Canada, China, and Russia. To that end, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for tonight's presentation. Before doing so, I will point out that you'll have the opportunity to ask our guests questions following the end of both presentations. So if I may, I would first of all like to introduce who will in fact be our first presenter, which is Marcus Kolga. Now, Marcus Kolga is an international award-winning documentary filmmaker, journalist, digital communication strategist, and importantly for us, a leading Canadian expert on Russian and Central and Eastern European issues. Marcus has a focus on communications and media strategies as tools of foreign policy and defense, and he continues to write commentary for national and international media, including the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star. We first tried to have Marcus and also Jonathan be at our conference last year, which was planned for April, and unfortunately, we know what happened. Everything shut down in March. Marcus is also the co-founder and publisher of Up North EU, an online magazine that features analysis and political and cultural news from the Nordic and Baltic region, and he frequently comments on Russian, Eastern, and Central European issues on North American radio and television and at foreign policy conferences, and fortunately for us, speaker events such as this. He also has a very strong record of involvement with international human rights organizations and national political organizations. Marcus, great to have you here tonight. Welcome.
Thank you.
Our second speaker, who I will introduce, is Jonathan Manthorpe. Jonathan is the author of a book well known entitled Forbidden Nation, A History of Taiwan, and it was published by Palgrave Macmillan. He's been a foreign correspondent and international affairs columnist for nearly 40 years.
Over.
He was European Bureau. I'm sorry about that, Jonathan, but I had, you don't look it, I can tell you. You must have been 10 when you started, or maybe 5.
I've been a journalist for 55 years.
That's fantastic. Jonathan was the European Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star and then Southern News in the late 70s and 80s. And in 89, he was appointed the Africa correspondent by Southern News. And in 93, posted to Hong Kong to cover Asia. Now, for the last few years, he's been based in Vancouver. Although I think right at this moment, Jonathan, you're in Victoria. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And you're having tea, I believe, at
I'm
this
having
time.
tea behind the
Lovely.
tweed curtain.
And he continues to write on international affairs and writes columns for the Post Media Group. He left the group last year, but he now writes for a large range of newspapers and websites, and he's published very, very frequently. So we're exceptionally thankful as well, Jonathan, you can be here tonight.
My pleasure.
I will then, at this point, if I may, I will ask Sylvia, who is our expert facilitator for tonight's presentation, to turn the microphone over to Marcus Kolga, who will talk to us about Russia. So I look forward to that. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Well, thank you to RCMI and Daniel for inviting me here today to participate in this really important discussion. It's a really great honor to be here with Jonathan. I read Claus the Panda last year when I was on my way to Taiwan, and it's a truly chilling account of Chinese influence operations in Canada, and I strongly recommend for everyone watching to read it, and if you haven't yet, go to your favorite online retailer and buy it. It would be great if we could have a Claus of the Bear book as well. I'm sure that everyone listening in today has seen the recent headlines about Alexei Navalny's recent incarceration in Moscow, and you've all been hearing about Russian disinformation and hacking over the past 4 years, and of course, Vladimir Putin's aggressive geopolitical ambitions since 2007. What I'd like to do tonight is to try and pull all of this into a Canadian context, what it means for Canadians, our security, and our interests and values. Now, the first rule to understanding Vladimir Putin is to recognize his primary goal, power, and how to keep it. Putin's domestic policies and nationalist propaganda are intended to mollify domestic discontent, while critics are silenced. He facilitates the corrupt enrichment of his officials to keep them on his side. He destabilizes Western democracies in part to demonstrate to Russian voters that democracy is an ugly and unstable system, so as to validate his own repressive authoritarianism. On the other hand, Putin knows that his relatively weak government can only compete with a fractured Western world that is at war with itself. My dear friend Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated just steps away from the Kremlin almost 6 years ago, used to remind me that Russia is ruled by Vladimir Putin, but Putin is not Russia, and Russia is not Putin. Russia is, in fact, a nation that is full of potential. A transparent, democratic, and free Russia could become a trusted, peaceful, and reliable partner for the Western world, from which the people of Russia would benefit the most with increased prosperity and mobility. This is the Russia that Boris Nemtsov dreamed of. It's one that Alexei Navalny might represent, but it is not Vladimir Putin's Russia. Last week, the Globe and Mail published a piece about two Canadian professors, one of whom serves as an advisor to Vladimir Putin's personal think tank, the Valdai Club, and both of whom are members of a Russian-Canadian trade advocacy organization. They advocated for a reset of Canadian relations with the Putin regime in a Kremlin-aligned Russian language foreign policy journal. They argued that Canadian trade would benefit from stronger bilateral relations, without mentioning that Russia buys less Canadian services and goods than Botswana or Bangladesh, ranking a lowly 43rd among international exports for Canada. They also encouraged the Russian government to use their soft power and social media to promote Putin's Russia in Canada without a hint of irony, failing to acknowledge that Russian intelligence had twice attacked Canadian organizations over the past 6 months, and that Russian information warfare and influence operations are, at least in part, responsible for the chaos that we're seeing in the United States today. These two academics concluded that, quote, realism dictates that we deal with Russia as it is now. And on this point, I could not agree more. Then what is the Russia of today? Russia is a nation that in the late 1990s was allowed to be brought under the control of a former agent of the Soviet intelligence services, the KGB. Vladimir Putin's ascent to become Russia's president allowed members of Russia's security organs, known as the Silovki, to seize control of Russia's government and most of its economy. Throughout the early 2000s, Putin's officials were allowed to plunder Russia's economy, stealing resources and corporations through a practice known in Russian as Rederstvo, or corporate raiding. Perhaps the most famous case of Russian government corruption is the case of Hermitage Capital. In 2005, Hermitage was the largest source of foreign investment in Russia and was run by my dear friend, US-born investor Bill Browder, who was blacklisted from Russia due to his activist investment. In 2007, Russian authorities raided the offices of Hermitage Capital, stealing corporate documents and seals that would be later used by corrupt authorities to falsely identify themselves as representatives of Hermitage when they submitted a fraudulent tax refund to Russian tax authorities for $232 million US. Bill's lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was assigned to investigate the situation when he discovered that Russian officials had stolen the money. Sergei reported the fraud to Russian authorities, who he thought would charge those who were responsible for the crime and clear Hermitage. Instead, Russian authorities detained Sergei Magnitsky, who spent nearly a year in prison, facing horrendous conditions and torture. He developed serious health problems, which were ignored by prison authorities. On November 16, 2009, he was transported to the notorious Matrosskaya Tishnya prison, the same prison that Alexei Navalny was transported to yesterday, where wounds on Sergei's arms and head indicated that he was severely beaten before he died. Since then, Sergei Magnitsky's name has become synonymous with one of the world's most successful human rights campaigns in history, which I've had the honor to help lead with Bill Browder and others, including Canada's former Justice Minister, Irwin Cotler, and those responsible for Canada's legislation, Senator Raynella Andrechuk, MP James Bazan, and of course, Chrystia Freeland. The Sergei Magnitsky Law, as it's known in Canada, although parenthetically speaking, staff at Global Affairs have been instructed not to use Sergei's name, which I presume is to avoid offending any corrupt human rights abusers. The law allows governments, including ours, to place targeted visa bans and asset freezes on individual human rights abusers, like those who are responsible for Sergei's incarceration and death. The Russian opposition leaders like Boris Nemtsov, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who has twice been poisoned to within a hair of his life, Garry Kasparov, and Alexei Navalny have all stated that the Sergei Magnitsky Law was and is the most pro-Russian legislation a foreign government could adopt. Why would they say this? Why would Russian activists urge foreign governments to hold Russian officials to account with sanctions? Because Vladimir Putin's government has engaged in the systematic repression of activists, critics, and independent media since he took office. Intimidation through poisoning, assassination, incarceration, and threats are all part of the Kremlin's toolbox designed to keep the boss in power, the boss who protects and enriches the corrupt officials. It's a symbiotic relationship based on greed, power, and corruption, which Magnitsky sanctions seek to break. These officials tend to hide their money abroad, take their vacations abroad, and they send their kids abroad. Take that away from them, and you're taking away the perks of their lifestyle. And we know sanctions are effective. Repealing the US Magnitsky Act was the primary focus of the infamous 2016 Trump Tower meeting between Russian lawmaker Natalia Veselnitskaya and the Trump team. Veselnitskaya also came after me when I organized an event to honor the memory of Boris Nemtsov here in Toronto in 2016 and suggested that the Russian Investigative Committee open up a case into my anti-Russian activities. Never mind that I was honoring a Russian hero. The Russian lobby against sanctions has been significant. The Russian government has deployed proxies, former academics, and Canadian diplomats, and created fake Potemkin community organizations to advocate on behalf of the Putin regime. A former Russian senator, Vitaly Malkin, was among the highest profile members of the Putin regime to actively campaign against Magnitsky sanctions in Washington and Canada. He was instructed to claim that Sergei was an alcoholic and heroin junkie who died of an overdose in prison, which is absolutely false. In Canada, Malkin had a personal interest in lobbying against Magnitsky sanctions. Publicly available court documents reveal that Malkin owned tens of millions of dollars in Toronto real estate assets, including an office building and several residential high-rises. In 2012, he evaded a Canadian entry ban using a false name on an Israeli passport and came to Canada to lobby parliamentarians to reject Magnitsky legislation. Malkin's ruse didn't last long. He was identified when his picture appeared in a local newspaper, and the strange story of his Russian senator's secret trip to Canada blew up nationally. Having failed Putin, Malkin was later stripped of the Russian Senate seat he had paid millions of dollars for because he had apparently failed to disclose his Canadian holdings and was not allowed to maintain dual citizenship, all of which had rather ironically been exposed by his lobbying against Magnitsky sanctions. Putin's active efforts to block or repeal Magnitsky sanctions and his organized attacks on those who support them are in themselves a demonstration of Magnitsky sanctions. It is widely believed that the brutal assassination of Boris Nemtsov in 2015 was due to his advocacy for Magnitsky sanctions in the US, Canada, and Europe. Vladimir Kara-Murza is also a supporter of Magnitsky sanctions, as I said before, and as is Alexei Navalny. Intimidation, violent repression, and attacks on critics have been a go-to tactic for Vladimir Putin since 2006. Critics abroad also face intimidation. Whenever I publish anything that is critical of the Putin regime in Canadian or international media, I'm attacked by a swarm of trolls. Last spring, York Region Police investigated death threats that were sent to me by a radicalized Russian nationalist after I criticized Russian historical propaganda narratives in a Toronto newspaper. This is the Russia that we're dealing with. Putin's aggressive foreign policy is designed primarily with the objective of projecting his power to the Russian people and the restoration of Russia's Soviet-era hegemonic and imperial power. It is a threat to Canadian security and that of our allies in NATO and beyond. Putin's record speaks for itself. In 2007, Putin attempted to destabilize Estonia with cyber attacks and staged ethnic riots. In 2008, Russian forces invaded parts of Georgia. And in 2014, Putin ordered a secret invasion of Crimea and staged a rigged referendum to secure his illegal occupation of it. That summer, a Russian surface-to-air book missile shot down a civilian airliner, Malaysian Airlines MH17, a clear act of terror that Russia has not yet been held to account for. The threat to our own borders and NATO is increasing. Over the past decade, Russia has engaged in a massive militarization of the Arctic with dozens of new or refurbished bases. Vladimir Putin has approved an Arctic strategy that calls for an aggressive expansion of Arctic resource claims. At the same time, Putin's propaganda blames NATO of imperialism, while we all know that NATO's mandate is defensive. This is the Russia that we're dealing with. We've all been made quite aware of Russian disinformation and influence operations since the 2016 US presidential election. Such tactics are not a new phenomenon. Active measures, as they're known in the Russian context, have been targeting Western nations since the end of World War II, but have become much more effective and dangerous in the digital era. The Kremlin's interference in the 2016 US presidential election and the destabilization of US democracy, of which the insurrection in Washington last week was a symptom of, cost Vladimir Putin less than one new main battle tank. With such destructive power and no incentive to curb it, why would Putin not intensify information warfare and influence operations in the Western world, including in Canada? In Canada, the Russian embassy has promoted smears of Canadian critics and elected officials, including Chrystia Freeland, which have contributed to an erosion of trust in our elected officials and have promoted hate towards entire communities, like the Ukrainian community, which has been repeatedly targeted by Russian state media and pro-Kremlin advocates in Canada. In the cyber realm, we've seen at least 2 Russian government hacks targeting Canada and its allies over the past 6 months. This follows a long string of them going back to 2007. Yet we have some Canadians suggesting a reset. Now, this is the Russia that we're dealing with. In conclusion, Canada needs to remain clear-eyed about the threat that Vladimir Putin's regime represents. The 90s era of hope for a Russian democratic transformation were poisoned by Putin and his clan of KGB kleptocrats in 2000, and they continue to hunt down and exterminate any hope of it. Canada must resist any efforts to reward Vladimir Putin with a reset of relations. A reset would only serve to divide us from our allies and further enable Putin's bad behavior. The Biden administration has signaled that it will take a tough position with Putin. Former Ambassador Mike McFaul has suggested Cold War containment, while Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland has signaled support for permanent NATO bases in the Baltic states. Canada should immediately open discussions with the Biden administration about how we can defend our shared interests, values, our borders, and indeed our democracies through the greater cooperation on sanctions and the war against foreign interference, and by reinforcing our support for NATO. The cohesion of our alliances and our democracies and society depend on it. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Well, Marcus, thank you very much. I'm glad you didn't pull any punches there. We'll have a chance, I think, to explore some of those themes that you brought out at the end of the presentation. So I'm looking forward to that very, very much. Jonathan, if I may, I think I would like to turn to you, if I may, and ask you to talk about another one of our interesting members of the international community. China. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Marcus, for a splendid gallop over what is a very heavy ground. An excellent job. I'm going to start by just echoing something you said in the China context, and that is, I think, to remind people that the People's Republic of China is not China, and that the Chinese Communist Party is not the Chinese people. I think that it is always very important for us in Canada to remember that whenever we're talking about this subject, because we have in our population 1.5 million people who are of ethnic Chinese heritage, and we have to be very, very careful to be distinct about what we are talking about in this context. I think I would also say that what I'm about to say, I think will show that in dealing with the People's Republic of China, we have a much more subtle adversary, perhaps, than Putin's Russia, but one that can be equally brutal when the occasion demands. Now, I agree with the premise of our discussion here, that there has been a distinct and continuing shift in the tectonic plates of international security geography, and that these have profound implications for Canada. The early rumblings of this shift can be seen in the years immediately after the end of the Cold War in 1989 and the ending of the discipline exerted on our alliances that conflict required. But I think that from the perspective of the Western Alliance, the moments of profound change came with the 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States and Washington's response. The declaration of the war on terror, and especially the unjustified invasion of Iraq by the George W. Bush administration, created fissures in the Western Alliance that have not healed. Actions by the Barack Obama and Donald Trump administrations have reinforced the picture that the United States is no longer a dependable ally or natural leader for middle power democracies. That, in my view, is not because of the qualities of those three American presidents, but because of the deep, unresolved conflicts within US society about who and what their country is for. Tomorrow sees the opening of a new chapter in that saga, but I don't expect the basic plot to change. I think there's a long way to go in the United States before they are able, if they ever are, to resolve these conflicts. So America's preoccupation with its domestic rifts has come at the time as the economic, political, and military rise of other nations, especially the People's Republic of China, is beginning to come to the fore. The PRC will soon be the world's largest economy, if it is not already. And its 30-year program of military modernization has made it a potent force in Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean regions. On current trajectories, it is inevitable that the PRC will be a global military and economic superpower by the middle of this century. The questions for us today, I guess, are how is that military power likely to be expressed, and how do we respond? Clearly, Beijing's overall objective is the same as all global powers. It wants to be able to support and defend its economic and political interests wherever they are. The more immediate questions, I would suggest, are how Beijing will pursue its unsatisfied territorial claims to the independent island nation of Taiwan, the islands in the East China Sea, owned by Japan, and disputed boundaries with India on the border with Tibet. Let me start by saying clearly that these claims are all rubbish. They have no legal, historical, political, moral, or any other justification. They are fabrications, mostly by revolutionary intellectuals in the early years of the last century as the occupying Manchu Qing dynasty was collapsing. These polemicists constructed a fabricated story of a unified nation of China and of Chinese people that never actually existed. I mean, even today, those of us who have traveled in China know what a vastly culturally, linguistically, geographically, culturally disparate country it is. For those of you interested in this fascinating story, I recommend the new book, The Invention of China, by the British author Bill Hayton, who is a fellow of Chatham House and of the Royal Geographic Society. The Chinese Communist Party adopted this mythical history of China and the Chinese people when it came to power in 1949, quickly invaded and conquered Tibet and Xinjiang, and is still pursuing other territories that have some association with the Qing, but which were never part of China. Indeed, it has staked some of the political legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party on gaining sovereignty over these territories, and that is the problem. For our purposes, I think the most useful example of modern Beijing warcraft for me to give you is its annexation of the South China Sea. This is an absolute classic example of Sun Tzu's doctrine of winning a war without fighting. I think this will be Beijing's preferred strategy for its other claims, especially Taiwan, unless it feels there is no other option but the use of military force. Let's just take an abbreviated look at the abbreviated timeline of events in Beijing's annexation of the South China Sea. It's been a brilliant piece of salami slicing achieved by never taking a step that was dangerous enough in itself to demand a firm military or diplomatic response from the United States or other powers. Real interest in ownership of the South China Sea started in 1969, when a United Nations-sponsored team found indications that there might be oil and gas in the seabed under and around the islands, reefs, and islets making up the Paracel and Spratly groups, and other features such as Scarborough Shoals and Mischief Reef. Successful exploration intensified during the 1980s and 1990s, and with it came clashes between Chinese vessels and those working for littoral states, principally Vietnam and the Philippines. The PRC mostly used Coast Guard vessels in these confrontations, but also what is known as the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia. This is China's militarized fishing fleet, and it was used as the shock troops for the takeover of much of the South China Sea. The militia has the great advantage for Beijing of being deniable if things go wrong, as they sometimes have, particularly with the Filipinos and also with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, and also of being able to be portrayed as victims in clashes with the Vietnamese, Filipinos, and the Japanese. There was some hope that when all the littoral countries signed the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that things would settle down and be resolved by law and diplomacy. No such luck. The clashes intensified in the early 2000s, and it became increasingly common for shots to be fired, and the PRC Coast Guards and fishermen began constructing what they called storm refuges for fishing boats in the Spratly Group and on Scarborough Shoals, which are well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. At the same time, Beijing tried to create its own faux administrative bodies for the whole of the South China Sea. It created a forward municipality on one of the Paracel Islands in the late 1980s. But then in 2014, it started requiring anyone fishing in the sea to acquire a Chinese fishing permit. Beijing made its next step in April 2014, when dredgers began constructing an island on Mischief Reef, east of the Spratly Islands, and again, well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The Manila government appealed to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, which in July 2016 ruled that there was no legal or historical basis for the PRC's claim to own the South China Sea. But by that time, it was too late. By that time, Beijing had expanded the Mischief Reef project into the construction of 7 islands, all of which have airstrips, some of them permanently manned with warplanes, as well as army garrisons, naval docks, and anti-aircraft missile batteries. At least we assume most of them are anti-aircraft missile batteries. Probably some of them are anti-ship batteries as well. As well as giving Beijing's forces oversight and to a significant degree control over everything that happens in the South China Sea, the 7 island bases also guard and monitor the approaches to the PLA Navy's main submarine base at Sanya on the southern tip of Hainan Island. It's built in caves into the cliffs of the southern end of the island and allows submarines to enter and leave while submerged, and therefore quite difficult to spot by satellite. But this means that Beijing has achieved one of its long-term strategic objectives, very strategic objectives, to break through the first chain of islands off the south and east coasts of China, all of them owned by US allies. One of the objectives for taking Taiwan is to break through this so-called first island chain. But China can now get its fleet of intercontinental ballistic missiles, its boomers, designed to deter anyone from a first strike on China, out into the Pacific Oceans and thus anywhere in the world, with reasonable confidence that they won't be tracked by the US or other navies. So the hard reality now is that with hardly a shot being fired, Beijing has taken control of one of the world's most important shipping lanes. And as things stand, that occupation cannot be ended without a full-blown war with the People's Republic of China. I will leave it there and hope that we get a good load of questions to discuss some of these issues. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. That was a tour de force. Excellent. Well done. Right. Let's see what we have here. We have someone in the Q&A. Jonathan, how do the conflicts in the South China Seas affect Canada?
Well, because of the importance of the shipping lanes for trade, they affect Canada as a trading nation. We have played our part with our navy, such as it is. We have sent sort of frigates on freedom of navigation trips through the South China Sea and also through the Taiwan Straits. This is as much an act of solidarity with our allies as much as anything, but it's not something that we've done in the past, and it's something that we should clearly be prepared to do in the future, as we, I think, should intensify our relationship with the middle power democracies of Asia, particularly Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Asia, Australia and New Zealand, obviously. Also, I think Indonesia, which is one of now the most advanced democracies amongst the 10 countries of Southeast Asia. Hopefully this is the carriage for this will be an expansion of the what is known as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Canada is a member of. It includes, I think, 12 countries now, but it should be expanded, I think, to include Taiwan and South Korea, certainly, and maybe others. There has to be, I think, a security element in this alliance of essentially middle power democracies in Asia.
Thank you. Marcus, question for you. You mentioned Russian activity in the Arctic region. How do you sort of rate what Russia's actions are doing from a threat perspective to Canada? Do you think that there is an actual issue of sovereignty violation going on, or do you think that it's more general in terms of them wanting to secure those bases and perhaps routes for their own purposes? How would you assess Russian activity in the Arctic vis-a-vis Canada?
Well, I don't think that the threat is immediate at this moment. We do see that there is a lot of these larger powers are lining up. They see the opportunity in the Arctic, China included. China, and I'm sure Jonathan can comment on this as well, that China just applied for, and if I'm not mistaken, received membership in observer status, at least in the Arctic Council.
In the Arctic Council, yeah.
And I know that China is preparing to make claims in the Arctic as well. They have a nuclear icebreaker that they've just built, but Russia has been rapidly militarizing. Through one side of their mouth, they claim to want peaceful cooperation in the Arctic, and they claim these sorts of things in the Arctic Council, but at the same time, They've constructed 24 new or refurbished bases, many with defensive capabilities. These are long-range bomber airfields. There has been they've recently installed a new nuclear base near the border with Norway, and just this week, Russia proudly announced that they had opened up a Soviet-era Arctic warfare and Arctic weapons research facility that had been shut down in the mid 90s, early 90s, and they've refurbished this to develop new Arctic weapons. So, you know, a country that behaves this way certainly does not seem to be looking for cooperation. The other thing is that they've openly said that Russia will be embarking on an aggressive strategy to increase their Arctic claims. So I think if we're looking forward, I think the potential for a conflict is certainly there. It's brewing. Russia is asserting itself in the Arctic, and looking at from a Canadian perspective, we're not doing a heck of a lot. And what we need to be doing is working with our Arctic partners, and including Sweden, NATO, of course. To see how we can cooperate. And, I think with this new Biden administration, there may be some opportunity to do that. So, yeah, the threat is there. It's certainly a long-term one.
Can I add on to that, please, Dan?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, the Chinese perspective is an interesting one. And I think that the Arctic is an area where there's been perhaps a little more cooperation between China and Russia than in some other areas. China has been running cargo ships to and from Europe through the Northeast Passage over Russia's north coast for about 10 years now. Not all that many ships, but several each summer, and they've hired Russian icebreakers to lead them through. It cuts about 2 or 3 weeks off the passage, the time of the passage from China to Europe, and therefore is a huge saving in transportation costs. China basically sees the Arctic as a shortcut to Europe. And with global warming, they are becoming more and more interested in positioning themselves from the future. As Marcus said, they recently joined the Arctic Council, but they've been fussing around in the Arctic with icebreakers for years and years now. There were even stories of a few years ago of them buying large tracts of land in Iceland to act as an entrepot for distribution of goods to Europe. It was a funny story, and it got a bit discredited, but there was certainly a Chinese billionaire who attempted to buy a very large chunk of coastal Iceland, and the suspicion was that he was working on behalf of the Chinese government to set up a port there in the way that China has established sort of almost exclusive ports of its own in several other countries across the Indo-Pacific region, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Djibouti, as we know, Mombasa in East Africa. And so it wouldn't surprise me if China didn't still have some ambition to set up an exclusive area in the Arctic or close to the Arctic for transportation. But, I think that we can see a few years down the line where that we are going to see Chinese merchant ships trying to use the Northwest Passage or running very close to claimed Canadian territorial waters, and this is going to be a security concern of one sort or another, whether it's one of sovereignty or of environmental protection or whatever, that we darn well better be ready for, and I don't think we are at the moment.
Thank you. Eric Morse, I think you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, Mark, this is mostly for Marcus. And by way of clearing my throat, I'd like to thank you for mentioning at the beginning that Reset article by Dudkevich. Because of its obvious provocative nature and the fact that I don't think Canadian mainstream media picked up on it, did it?
The Globe did run an article about it.
As long as they only printed an article about it. But anyway, the big question, or the topical question right now is Navalny. And I saw the discussion you had with Natasha Fatah on CBC a few days ago. Since then, he's been transferred to Sailor's Rest Prison, and nothing looks very good. And Michael Bocherkiv mentioned yesterday that he thinks that it may have been bad timing and political misjudgment on Navalny's part. What's your take on things as they unfold?
Well, sure. The timing wasn't great. Should he have waited for the spring? I think you could argue that. My sense is that look, he's called for his supporters to come out onto the streets on the 23rd. The fact that there were literally thousands of supporters who braved, it was minus 32 degrees on Monday night in Moscow. Thousands of his supporters flocked to the airport that he was supposed to arrive at, waited outside for hours for him. I think that's a sign that his supporters are not going away. If I'm Putin, there are no good options at this point. I would be surprised if there were some sort of a tragic accident in the next month. I suspect that after these 30 days that he's being held for, I think Putin is going to hope that his supporters cool off. That's not going to happen. I predict that he'll get a longer prison term at the end of the 30 days. The other question is, how does the Western world react? So I think Canada, with our new foreign minister, Marc Garneau, he was out of the gates pretty quickly on Twitter and condemned the arrest and called for Navalny's immediate release. I think we've been pretty good at expressing concern on, when China does certain things, especially with regards to the two Michaels, and other human rights issues. The question is, are we going to work with our allies now? Are we going to use our Magnitsky sanctions? Are we going to hold the regime to account? What concrete steps are we taking? I think that's the big question right now. We know that Navalny is going to be in that prison, for 30 days. What do we do during that time? That's the big question right now.
Could I ask Marcus? Marcus, do you think that the timing of his return to Russia was? Do you think he was thinking about the change of administration in the US and whether this might be of assistance to him? That whether it could encourage Biden to take a position on or see an opportunity to take a position on Russia, which has not been forthcoming during the Trump years?
No, absolutely. I think that he certainly waited until Biden was to take office. I think we're going to see a lot more support for the Russian opposition movement from the incoming administration. I think it's just a tougher position overall on Russia. So in that regards, yes, I think the timing definitely coincided with the inauguration tomorrow.
Thank you.
Jets, a question really for both of you. Sorry. How would you assess the relative, or to step back a minute, the CSE's concern with Russia and China was clearly stated in terms of being a strategic threat, but that threat was mostly around the issue of cyber. And influence operations. How would you assess the relative strengths and weaknesses of Russia and China in that regard? I mean, obviously, this is an important tool for them. How would you assess the relative strengths and weaknesses of their abilities? And at the same time, What's your assessment of Canadian capability? Are we in a weakened position? Do you think we are doing everything we can to be able to resist those cyber and influence activities? Marcus, I can ask you to go first, please.
Jonathan, did you want to go first?
No, it's fine. You go first, Marcus. It's fine.
Okay, I've taken a look at the CSE report as well, and I think it was largely limited to cyber. As far as the threat to Canada from Russia, it's quite clear. I think I mentioned in my opening remarks that we've had at least two attacks that we know of that have been attributed to Russia, to the FSB. Over the past 6 months. First was in July when we know that Russian hackers hacked into Canadian, UK, and US medical research facilities that were looking into COVID vaccines. We know that. And then most recently we had the SolarWinds hack. Now, I know General Vance came out and told, I think, the Globe and Mail that Canadian defense systems were not affected, but he also, after he stated that, he also said he didn't know, and we don't know. We don't know whether if those systems were penetrated, and if those hackers got in, those hackers could still be lurking in those systems, and we may not know about it for a year, 2, 5 years down the road. We just wouldn't know. So we do know that they have these capabilities. They're pretty darn good at it. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? I think CSE has continuously warned us of the threat. But we don't seem to be taking any action. The U.S., conversely, they did take action against the group of GRU, that's the military intelligence hackers that hacked into the Democratic National Committee servers in 2016. They placed sanctions on them. They've charged them. We haven't done so with any of the hacks that have affected Canada. We do have offensive cyber capabilities. One of the things that I've been recommending is that we work together with our allies, specifically the US and the incoming administration with US Cyber Command, to develop those offensive capabilities. I think we need to present the Russians, the Chinese, other governments that engage in this sort of malicious activity. We need to demonstrate that we also have those capabilities in order to deter future attacks. Right now, there is very little cost to engaging in this sort of activity, especially for the Russians. We're not placing sanctions on them. We're not hitting back. We need to start doing something. And as far as influence operations go, I would move away from the CSE because the CSE report wasn't very good on it. I would look at, and I would recommend all of our listeners to look at the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliament report of 2019. It was tabled last March, and it sort of got sidelined by COVID. But that report was excellent in that it clearly defined the threat from Russia, from Iran, from China, with regards to influence operation and disinformation. And it clearly stated that all of those represent an existential threat to our democracy and our entire society. And I don't think that our government has yet, despite this report being tabled by an all-party committee, our government hasn't. They've barely acknowledged the threat. They did an okay job. They seemed to acknowledge it before the 2019 elections. There were some measures put in place, but after the 2019 elections, all of those measures disappeared, except for the rapid reaction mechanism within global affairs. And we haven't developed any sort of strategy to combat this since then. There's been zero response from our government. So I'm really concerned, and working in disinformation and monitoring it, I'm seeing a lot of the same things that set the stage for the US and for the insurrection in Washington. Those same groups are operating in Canada. The narratives that are fueling those movements are being promoted by foreign actors, Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and we're not doing anything. And if we don't do anything about it, if we don't start taking this problem seriously, we are in serious trouble.
Thank you, Marcus. Jonathan, would you like to comment on this?
Yes,
on that subject?
Yeah, I think in some contrast, the threat of Chinese influence, intimidation, and intrusion in Canada is more, if I can put it this way, hummint rather than sigint. as I set out in the book Claws of the Panda, the Chinese Communist Party has been working on establishing agents of influence and the ability to tailor Canadian politics, business, academia to the ends of the Chinese Communist Party for 60, 70 years. It goes back, in fact, to the Second World War and even before that. And it's been very successful for them. It is Canada has Canadian political leaders, officialdom, academia has basked in this delusion that we have a special relationship with Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party, which has worked very well to the favor of Beijing. And it's really only, I think, in the last few months, and particularly, I think, in the wake of the Meng Wanzhou affair and the hostage taking of the two Michaels, that the Canadian establishment, in the broad sense, has really woken up to the fact that we do not have a special relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. We never have had, in reality. We've been played for suckers for the best part of 60, 70 years. And I'm afraid that, I've, as you can imagine, with my book coming out at almost the same time that Meng Wanzhou was detained, I've been watching events very, very carefully. And I have seen no real signs yet that the Canadian establishment is prepared to look at reality and realize that we have to totally redefine what is a possible and pragmatic and useful relationship with the People's Republic of China. I wish I could be more hopeful about it, but the Canadian public has made a clear decision that they do not trust and don't think that that Beijing can be trusted. Those that have any faith or trust in Canada's relationship with China is now barely in the teens, and I think that the Chinese Communist Party has achieved this all by itself by the taking of hostages. I mean, and I think people realize we cannot have a normal diplomatic relationship with a regime whose first response when there is a diplomatic problem is to take hostages. We can't. I mean, we share no values. We have no common values with this regime. We have a trade relationship, and that's about as far as it is now, and as far as it is ever going to go. We are not, as some Canadian academics, politicians, and officials believe, we are not going to change China. There is no chance of that. And we can't avoid having a relationship with China, but we need to keep it simple, transactional, and that's it. The sooner that we produce a clear statement of a new policy of China that is simple and transactional and functional, the better. Because at the moment we're just getting fog out of Ottawa and all Ottawa's branches.
Sorry, I have a follow-up question for Jonathan.
Well,
so I would completely agree. I think that if you compare Chinese influence operations in Canada versus Russian influence operations, China's operations are far more sophisticated. They are the intimidation of the diaspora and those organizations. It's sinister. What's happening? Yeah. How would you suggest? What is the solution here? How do we? I mean, we have to stand up to this sort of behavior. This is free speech is a fundamental human right, and by our inaction, we are allowing the Chinese government to trample over our rights as Canadian citizens living in Canada,
right? In
our free speech. How should we address this?
Yeah. Let me just add on to that. So far as influence is concerned, I mean, one of we have many problems, but one of them is the Chinese Communist Party controls pretty well all Chinese language media in Canada. all of it. And as they do in Australia and as they do in the United States and other countries where there's large elements of the diaspora. I've thought about this a great deal. When I started, when it was possible to do a book tour in 2019, and I had audiences with Canadians of Chinese heritage in the audience, I got a consistent message all over the country from them. And they said, Jonathan, when you're doing this tour, would you please try to get mainstream Canada to understand the daily pressure we are under from Chinese Communist Party organizations in our communities. Now, there's the most sinister of the organizations that you mentioned is the United Front Work Department, which has a long history, but basically it is the political warfare arm of the Chinese Communist Party. It has a huge presence here in Canada. It has managed to gain control of several long established sort of benevolent organizations within the Chinese community and all this sort of thing. Dealing with it, I think, is a very, very difficult problem. And we are a democracy and we believe in freedom of speech, as you say, and freedom of association. But we have to confront, I think, the reality that the quickest way to lose democracy is an excess of tolerance. That we have to, in order to sustain democracy, we have to make it clear what we will not put up with. And that includes intrusion by foreign powers. And the Australians and the Taiwanese have both introduced legislation to regulate and, where necessary, expel foreign political organizations attempting to intrude in their domestic political affairs. I think we should do the same. I mean, we should have done it before now, but we should definitely use. The problem, of course, we have, and why I'm sure the big heads in Ottawa are a little queasy, is that we have a lot of other foreign countries exerting political influence and even funding organizations in Canada, including, of course, the United States. I mean, I think it would be a good idea to expel some of those too, but there we are. But there are others. For example, the Indian government keeps a very close eye on the Sikh organizations here and the Sikh population. I mean, you may remember that rather funny story when the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi came on a visit fairly soon after the election of the Trudeau government, and he said to Trudeau, "You have more Sikhs in your government than I do." Now, the Liberal Party took that as a great compliment to Canadian multiculturalism, but of course, for Modi, for whom the independentist movement of the Sikhs is a daily problem, and of course, which is to a substantial degree financed and managed from here, it was not a compliment at all. So the Indian governments here and their agents keep a fairly close eye on what is going on. Iranians do as well. There's that's a whole other story and ball game. So there are many reasons, quite apart from the United Front Work Department, for us to really seriously engage with the notion that we need to control the political activities of foreign governments and foreign organizations in this country. But I think the other thing is transparency. I think that we should give CSIS or some or through the government the ability to identify and publicize the existence of United Front operations here. They've done it quite a bit with the Confucius Institute in our educational establishments. Confucius Institute, it looks on paper as though it comes under the Chinese education department and it's a nice free cultural exchange. It's actually a United Front operation, and CSIS has gone around to various colleges and universities that have these things and really explained to them, as though they shouldn't have needed to do it, that these are in fact espionage outposts. So CSIS has been far more active than it used to be with the public a few years ago. I think it could be more so in the interests of transparency, and that would go a long way to helping the situation.
Let me see if I can weave together two or three questions that seem to have a kind of common theme. We're familiar, I think, with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And we've also seen with Russia, for example, their involvement in the Syrian conflict. There seems to be sort of a comparative narrative there in terms of, China as a kind of a global, or having global ambition, whereas Russia seems to have a more limited, shall we say, geographical ambition, perhaps to restore, a stronger Western buffer between themselves and the NATO countries. And yet you see Russia being active in places like Syria and to some extent even in Africa. How would you sort of assess their level of ambition? Perhaps I'll start with you, Marcus, in terms of what you view Russia's level of ambition to be. You've obviously pointed out the fact that at the heart of it, it's Putin hanging on to power. But do you think he really has ambitions to go much beyond his backyard or his defensive geography? Do you think he'll go into other places around the world in a much more direct way? And then, Jonathan, I'll come back to you to get your assessment of how well you think the Belt and Road Initiative is going. Marcus?
Sure thing. Well, we've already talked about the Arctic. We know that there is a formal, his ambitions are to expand Russian resource extraction in the Arctic. They're moving ahead with that. So that's what they're doing there. With regards to Central and Eastern Europe, I think that NATO has effectively put a stop to his expansion in that region. I think that any sort of aggression in that area, in Central and Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, I think a lot of it was political. I think Vladimir Putin sees himself as the rightful successor to Joseph Stalin, and he's said before that he would like to reconstitute the Soviet Union. But as I said, I think the NATO EFPs in the Baltics have largely put a stop to that. In Africa, well, certainly in Syria, I think that in Syria, Russia has been looking for a toehold in the region, and it's achieved that in its support for the Assad regime. I'm more concerned about what's happening in Africa. Russia has been very active in Mozambique. A lot of the influence operation and disinformation operations that we saw in 2016 that were focused in the US, those resources in St. Petersburg that are run out of the Internet Research Agency, the Troll Factory as we call it, have really focused on operations in Libya and in Mozambique over the past 12 to 24 months. And the same gentleman, a man named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who owns the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, also owns a militia group, a private army called the Wagner Group. And that Wagner Group has been active in Mozambique as well. So I think that the Kremlin has some ambitions in Africa. The fact that I think Western Europe, certainly North America, has been largely absent from Africa. There's quite a bit of opportunity there. And what I see over the next decade or so, if we don't start looking at Africa again, is that China will be the big winner in Africa, but Russia will be trying to carve out its parts as well. And we're going to be shut out completely.
Yeah, I agree very much, Marcus. If you look at the demographics projections for the next 30, 40, 50 years, the major growth, population growth, the countries with the youngest populations and therefore with the greatest potential for growth, economic growth and general growth over the next 30, 40 years are in Africa. China has an aging population, as do many other countries in Asia. and indeed in Europe. China sees Africa not only as a source of resources, but also of agriculture. Only 20% of China's land mass is arable, farmable land. So they have been using Africa for 20 years or so as a garden. They were beginning to move in there when I lived there in the late 80s and early 90s. But now they have established massive farming estates with Chinese labor. They don't use local people. They bring in Chinese labor. The same as with a lot of their mining and extraction industries as well. And in the course of it, they've also, in several countries, taken over much of the retail trade and destroyed local industries. I lived in Zimbabwe. One of the benefits of sanctions during the Ian Smith regime in the 1960s and 70s was the development of huge and substantial and significant local industries to be able to produce goods that were otherwise sanctioned. The result was that when we lived there in the late 1980s and early 90s, Zimbabwe was one of the most productive countries in Africa because it produced. Zimbabwe could actually produce a petrol engine, a gasoline engine, which not many countries can. It's even the countries that assemble cars, Japanese cars, often can't make a petrol engine. They could make a petrol engine in Zimbabwe when we lived there. Not anymore. All the local products have been sidelined, and it's now all Chinese goods, and that's happened all over Africa. So China sees Africa not as in much the same way, I think, as the British saw India in the 17 and 1800s, as not only a source of resources, but also as an internal market for its goods. And the Chinese government has embarked on a very successful campaign of what is known as elite capture. There are many of the despots in various African countries who have been bought and paid for by the Chinese Communist Party, and we'll see what happens. One of the economies in Africa are developing on their own very substantially, and with that is coming a good deal of political unrest. So, I mean, we thought when I was living there that maybe the age of the big man, the petty despot, was over. In several countries it is, but hopefully the economic development in Africa will be accompanied by political development, and that will limit the ability of China to take control. But just on the BRI, on the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a lot of pushback now against it. We've all heard about the debt trap, which has allowed the Chinese Communist Party to take control of a port in Sri Lanka, not so much, but nevertheless a port in Pakistan, the Mombasa in Kenya, and even in Europe. Half the port of Piraeus, the port of Athens and of Greece, is owned by China. Their use of debt traps has been very clever, but it has created a very strong pushback, and not least of which, and we don't hear much about this, and we should. If I was still a foreign correspondent, this is where I'd be heading: Central Asia. In countries like Kazakhstan, which is essential to China's vision of the Belt and Road Initiative, the transportation links with the Middle East and Europe, there is huge pushback in Kazakhstan, not from the government, but from ordinary people in Kazakhstan, against Chinese investments there and against the Belt and Road projects there. A lot of it is because China brings in labor and doesn't hire local people to do these projects, but also, again, something that deserves a little more attention than it gets, is that it's not only the Uyghurs that are being detained and put in these concentration camps in Xinjiang. There are a lot of Kazakhs in Xinjiang as well who are being victims of the China's re-education for Muslim programs, and so there is a lot of resentment in Kazakhstan in particular against the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is a plug in the whole bottle. And that, together with the debt traps, has made a lot of countries along the path of this proposed project very suspicious and very hesitant to get into bed with Beijing on this whole thing. So I think at the moment it's stalled, and COVID has added to that, of course. But we'll see what happens in a year or two when the COVID pandemic is a bit behind us.
Well, gentlemen, I think we've managed to touch on all of the questions that have been posted. I don't think we've managed to answer all of them directly, but you've certainly done a great job of covering, I think, sufficient ground to satisfy people who have posted questions and some of the chat discussion. I think what you've both brought really quite clearly to the fore is that if in my mind I had been thinking about the possibility that China and Russia were a potential threat to Canada directly, you have certainly corrected me very clearly, and we now see where those threats are coming from, with Russia very clearly in the Arctic, for sure, and this is going to be an ongoing issue, and of course the cyber and influence activities, which they are very, very adept at, and to imagine that we are not susceptible to that kind of influence activity, I think would be extremely naive. And I think, Marcus, I think you've done a great job of making that very, very clear. At the same time, with China, yes, I've heard, they're very effective in what you call the human intelligence side, and being able to infiltrate the diaspora and influence Chinese residents of Canada and various organizations and being able to basically bend them to the will of the Chinese Communist Party, both directly and through media, for example. So I think that is also extremely a clear message that you've given to us. I really enjoyed, well, I didn't enjoy it, but I think I cottoned on very much to the comment you made about the excess of tolerance. And I think that goes both to the Chinese and to the Russian potential threats, that we spend a lot of time in Canada being very concerned about our domestic politics. We understand the complexities of having a multicultural society and the diasporas in our society, and how that plays out, and how do we react when the home states, the home countries, if you will, of those diasporas act in ways that are detrimental to us, and how do we deal with that? I hope that the messages that you are providing us here tonight, and in your further research and in your publications, eventually reaches some ears and eyes in Ottawa, and initiates some action there. So I won't. I could go through and do a brief summary of some of the key points, but I won't do that right now. For those who are perhaps first-time attendees, you should know that this has been videotaped. This presentation has been videotaped, and the good Eric Morris will have that up relatively soon onto our YouTube channel, and you can watch this again and dissect these insightful comments in your own time. So first of all, let me thank Marcus and Jonathan for taking the time to be with us. It's a great privilege. We really wish we could have had you in Toronto at the RCMI last April, and all things being equal, we will definitely have you there at some point in the future. We know people would love to see you. If I may, I'd also like to thank Sylvia Lau, who is our host tonight. She is the master of all things behind the screen and does a great job. Very, very responsive and just a wonderful person to work with. So thank you very much, Sylvia, for your work tonight. We obviously tonight focused on Russia and China, and on February the 16th at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, we're going to focus on Iran and North Korea. And we have Dr. Pierre Pahlavi, who is an expert on Iran, and Mr. James Trottier, who is an expert on North Korea. So I do hope you have an opportunity to join us for that event. That's February the 16th. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I very much appreciate your time tonight. I think it was an excellent presentation. I learned a lot, and I hope you did as well. So Marcus, please stay safe. Jonathan, stay safe. And everybody else out there, stay safe. We're all in a semi-lockdown position wherever you may be, and we're all looking forward to something that looks a little bit more normal. I very much appreciate your time tonight. I look forward to seeing you again at some of our events in the very near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, Marcus. It was a great evening. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to all the listeners. Thanks.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.